Mike Franc with FREOPP, Chief Research Officer, and want to welcome everybody here, especially the other FREOPP scholars who are here. This is about the safety net, and the idea is to talk a little bit about what we should be doing about the safety net in the broader context of the welfare state, the kind of incentives the welfare state creates for the people who receive the benefits. And just to kick off the discussion, we were looking especially at this notion people may drop out of the workforce, may engage in behaviors they otherwise would not engage in because of the availability of benefits. So I took these from a book Senator Phil Gramm wrote with two other economists, and he points out that in the bottom quintile of earners, the median wage income for the year is $2,200, but under $200 per month. Not surprised, but those people also get, on average, something like $43,000 in a variety of benefits, 43. Among the prime age working persons in that bottom quintile, between the ages of 18 and 65, only 36% worked. Okay, half actually were retired. But basically, the workforce participation rate was a fraction of what it is for the prime age workers, and when you hold income, get income somewhat higher. The other point to raise is that those workers only worked 17 hours a week. So the question is, what's causing that? How do we deal with it? And for that, we have two terrific panelists, Michael Tanner and Aparna, and they're going to go and drill down on this. Anybody prefer going first? Michael wants to go first.
Michael got volunteered. Remember my time in the military, never volunteer. One can quibble a little bit with Phil Gramm's numbers. I think scholars will argue this or that, but I think in the general he's got the right point here, which is that you can look at the way benefits are structured in the social welfare system we have today, and they can act as a disincentive to work, not at the bottom end of it, but more at the top end. Scholars talk a lot about what's called a welfare cliff, and that is the idea that you reach a point in the welfare system in which if you earn any additional money, you immediately start losing your benefits, you start paying more in taxes, you start incurring the expenses of going to work, and you can actually end up worse off financially at the end of the day than if you had taken that job in the first place. They just had a case in Missouri where they're looking at it, and if you earn $1 over a certain limit, I think it was $25,000 a year, if you earn $25,001, you lost $8,000 in benefits. So this is going to have a natural discouragement of income, at least among the top people who are able to work, people who have a tied to the labor force, people who have an education and have skill background, so on. They are, they're not sitting there calculating the marginal tax rate per se, but they understand that it's just not a good deal for them to take that job or to get a raise or to get a promotion and so on. Then at the same time, you also have to look at the people at the bottom of the income scale who aren't working at all, who don't have the skills, who don't have ties to the workforce, who have some other thing that's keeping them out, licensing requirements. They have a criminal record. About 1 in 5 Americans has a criminal record that makes it more difficult to get a job. So you have people at the bottom of the scale who can't work, and people at the top end of the scale who are being discouraged from work. So our sort of social welfare safety net's not working at either end of the scale there.
Thank you, Michael. Both Michaels for starting this discussion. So I think with that particular statistic, if you look at the safety net, and I'm going to start with what is the purpose of the safety net? The purpose of the safety net, we're often just talking about work incentives and what is that doing to, there's Robert, to people's desire to work, and are we pushing people out of the labor force? And I want to start off with what is the primary purpose of the safety net? The primary purpose of the safety net is to actually provide people the help that they need. And if you look at the actual usage of safety net programs, we are well below 100% for a lot of them. So there are certain programs like SNAP, which is food stamps, and if you look at the tax credit programs, usage is much higher. For SNAP, it's something like 70 to 80% of eligible people qualify for SNAP. If you look at, things like the earned income tax credit, it's 78%. But if you actually go down the list of who's using cash welfare, right? What's the participation rate for TANF? It's about 18%. If you look at the participation rate for housing subsidies, it's again about 20%. If you look at participation rates for the Women's, Infants, and Children's program, it's about 50%. So if you look at how the safety net is truly working, I think we have to sort of step away from I would say, like, these are the side sort of challenges that we face in designing a system that needs to work for people who need that help. In my personal research, I've also started looking at multiple program usage, right? When we think about the safety net, we assume that people are tapping into SNAP and they're getting the cash help that they need, and they're using housing subsidies, and they're getting SSI, and all of the different many different programs that the US government provides. And actually, when you look at the SIP survey, which is the Survey of Income and Program Participation, and you say, well, how many people actually who are 130% of the federal poverty line or below actually end up using more than one program? It's about a third. If you look at people who's saying we don't use any of these benefits, so I'm not looking at the 80 different programs. I said I'm going to look at non-tax credit programs, and I looked at about 8, 9, or 10 of them. And within those programs, it's only about 45% of people say we don't actually end up using any of these benefits. So I think there's a primary problem, which is what I think we're here to discuss. One, that usage of the safety net is, there are various problems with the way the safety net is working currently. And yes, we can worry about abuse of the safety net. And, as Michael pointed out, I think he made a great point, because when you start to think about multiple program usage, that's where the benefits cliffs come in, right? Like, I've applied for this program, I'm getting cash assistance. Does that make me ineligible for SNAP? Does that make me ineligible for housing subsidies, right? And if I earn that extra dollar, which could be from another benefit program, but which could be from work, right? Do I suddenly lose all of these benefits that I was eligible for? So I think there are multiple reasons that might drive low participation in the workforce. I think benefit cliffs are a reason. As Michael also pointed out, sometimes people don't have the ability to participate in the workforce, maybe because of health reasons, maybe because of childcare concerns, maybe because they would rather go in, and get an education. But so I think there are many challenges with the way the safety net currently works, and we need to look at them holistically and figure out methods to redesign it or make it work better.
So, one rule in policy is garbage data equals garbage policy. All of the data that you just heard is deliberate garbage. Absolute garbage. It's been garbage for 50 years. The SIP survey is completely and totally inaccurate, as is the current population survey. They are just absolutely, totally incorrect, and they're known to be totally incorrect. I've been working on this since the Carter administration. They were incorrect in the Carter administration. They're much worse now. Okay, so the simplest thing would be if you take a traditional program like food stamps and you measure utilization of that program in any of these surveys, well, you're missing 40 to 50% of the utilization. Okay, it's absolutely meaningless. The earnings rates are all utterly incorrect. So when you say, oh, all these people that are so ostensibly eligible for food stamps because of the earnings that are reported in the CPS, well, the earnings in the CPS are false, okay? And you can't use those false earnings in order to get eligibility for these benefits. How do we know that these data are false? Because we have a research project that's been going on for a quarter of a century, and will go on for another quarter of a century because it threatens the foundations of the welfare state. And that is called an integrated administrative data survey, where what you do, because you've known this data goes all the way back to the 1950s, the current population survey. 1950s. It was wrong in 1950, okay? Every time you look at this, like, What did you capture for AFDC benefits? You're missing 45% of it. You're missing 45% of food stamps. You're missing 35% of low income earnings. It's just totally incorrect. All right. And that's not an accident. It's not an accident that we've been running incorrect surveys for a half a century. Okay. How do we know, in addition to the fact that the outgo that is spent is never captured in these surveys, which would seem to be a problem, you know? I don't know. Maybe I'm just a perfectionist, okay? But we know because we have a thing called integrated survey data where you actually take the families that appear in these records and then you go over to the food stamp record. Or you go over to the IRS and ask, what were their earnings reported in the IRS? What did they get from EITC? Let's look at the housing records. What did they get? All of a sudden, wow, they have dramatically different. A third of all the earnings for so-called poor families with children don't appear, although they're appearing in the IRS for any one of these things. And this project has been a research. If you want to have nothing happen in Washington, the first thing you do is do a committee, right? We'll have a committee to study this. The second thing is you have a research project. This research project has been going on for a quarter of a century, okay? Under the Trump administration, Bruce Meyer, who's at AEI, got in there and he pushed this forward and against the opposition of the bureaucracy. Because they don't want accurate data. And he got to the point it was almost taking place, and then the election came, and I can guarantee you that thing is dead in the water again, and it's not going to be enacted in my lifetime, maybe some younger people here. Quarter a century of delaying this thing. It gives you accurate information. The best I could say is that the typical family that is counted as poor, now 95% of the normal poverty survey, 95% of welfare spending, which is about $1.4 trillion a year, 94% of it doesn't appear as income. The war on poverty never happened, according to these surveys. But if you try to take what's actually spent and you can analyze who gets it using this administrative records or other data, what it shows you is that the average so-called poor family with children, in fact, has about $55,000 a year in earnings, cash, food, housing, and medical care from the government, okay? So we have to have correct data. That's the first thing. Correct data, correct measurement of poverty, correct count of actual welfare spending, which is about $1.6 trillion a year. Second thing, we need to use the lessons that we've had from the past, okay? One lesson is work works, okay? I've been doing this since the Carter administration. All you need to do, you don't want to extend the benefits up the income scale. That just puts more people on welfare, expands the already enormous welfare system. Means tested welfare is about 6 to 7% of GDP. Doesn't need to be any bigger, okay? But you put a work requirement on the benefit. You just say, look, if you want to get free stuff from the government and you're able-bodied, we expect you to work or prepare for work as a condition of getting that aid. That was the core principle of welfare reform in the 1990s. It has a 90% approval rate among Democratic voters, okay? You don't need to make the welfare state bigger. You just need to say, we will help you, but we expect you to help yourself. As soon as you do that, the caseload plummets. Okay, for one reason, it cuts fraud because a lot of people have the jobs. We call them, I forgot to tell you about this job. Okay, we have a job that I forgot to tell you about, and I cannot be at my forgotten job at the same time I have to come into the welfare office to do job training or whatever you want. You can't be two places at once. The caseload drops dramatically. The number of people that come in the front door to get a work-based program is a fraction of those that will come in to get something for nothing, okay? Not because they're evil people, but something for nothing is more attractive than something you have to work for. And as a result, the caseload falls, and you have these dramatic effects in terms of reductions of actual poverty and improvements of work, but primarily what I would say, so we have correct data, we have work, we have marriage, okay? Welfare reform in the 1990s was not based on making single moms work hard, okay? That was one aspect of it. But the reality was that in that period, the percentage of children that were born outside of marriage was going up 1 to 2% a year, had been going up steadily year after year after year. rising from 7% to around 38%. 7% at the beginning of the war on poverty, 38 or so. And welfare reform came in, that curve stopped going up. Teen pregnancy, teen births, it looks like Mount Everest. It goes up like this, it quadruples in about a 20-year period. Welfare reform comes in, it falls with the exact same slope. It falls. This never happens in social science. Every indicator, non-marital births, non-marital pregnancies, abortions go down. We can talk about that later. Abortions go down, non-marital births, non-marital pregnancies go down, marriage stabilizes, does not fall. It's a huge, huge success, and nobody knows this, okay? Nobody wants to know this. And so work, marriage, and then finally, budget control. We spend close to $1.6 trillion a year. We very nearly added another $300 billion a year through the Build Back Better bill. That was defeated by 2 votes, okay? And it was defeated because the conservative, so-called conservative Republican Party has dropped this issue for about 20 years. They have said nothing about it. And meanwhile, the left continues to push to not only reverse welfare reform, to go back to subsidies for single mothers that don't work, but expand and expand and expand. And if you can't fight something with nothing, okay, if you want to constrain welfare spending, which most conservatives want to do, you have to know how to do it. Welfare spending has been cut only one time in U.S. history. That was in the Welfare Reform Act of 1996. It was cut because we never talked about cutting spending, okay? We froze spending in nominal dollars, but the entire debate was about work and marriage, where you had 80 to 90% of the American public were on our side. We changed those things. We emphasized work. We froze what was the AFDC program in nominal dollars, so it hasn't gone up, which is a huge reduction in spending in that program, totally maybe $70 billion a year. And you have all the marriage stops declining, teen pregnancy plummets, non-marital births and pregnancy plateau, all of those effects, and we spent less money on a system that's much more efficient in terms of promoting the well-being of the poor. Those are the lessons we have here. One other lesson I would just toss out. There's about $60 billion is spent on programs that are designed to cause empowerment or positive behavioral change. 2 of those would be like drug treatment or anti-recidivism programs, okay? We can all agree that those programs ought to exist, right? But they don't work, okay? None of them work when you do a controlled evaluation of them. How can, so the model is, we'll find programs that do work and we'll try to replicate them. Replication doesn't work. It categorically does not work. So what could you do about that? I would like to have anti-recidivism programs that work. That would be nice. Probably nice for the recidivists too. You know, there's nothing worse than putting a poor person into a program you know in advance doesn't work. But we do that all the time. How do you do this? What you do is, instead of paying for service provided, you pay for actual outcomes, okay? So in an anti-recidivism program, instead of just paying, you had counseling sessions and so forth, you pay for a number of years that the person stays out of jail or is not charged. With a drug treatment program, you pay for clean urine cups, okay? You produce a clean urine cup, you get money. And what will happen if you did that, the left, first of all, would absolutely hate that, because it would drive the entire social service industry out of business, because they don't do anything, okay, when you evaluate them. But you would find that all of the bad programs would begin to drop out, and you would begin to see a few of them that seem to be doing things, and the money would automatically move into those programs. That would be very, very beneficial for the taxpayer, but in particular for the people that you're actually trying to help with those programs. So work, marriage, budget control, program effectiveness, and don't lie to the American people with bogus data.
Can I just...
I was going to just offer you that.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert. I feel like you solved the poverty problem right here, sitting right here. Just in terms of the data, this is coming from administrative data. So you're exactly right. When you look at multiple benefit usage, it's much harder to look at administrative data, because all of these programs are administered by different agencies, so you don't have that integrated benefits take-up rate that you would ordinarily want to use. What we do have is, yes, the the administrative data says SNAP usage is about 82% of eligibles, EITC is at 78%, all of the other numbers, TANF is administrative data. Now we can go back and say, well, even administrative data doesn't seem to get at the problem, but I don't think that that's the point you're trying to make, right? No. I completely agree with the survey, with the survey data. Bruce Meyer has done an excellent job of pointing out that in household surveys, people do tend to underreport benefits. If you compare household surveys to administrative data, yes, you do see underreporting. And so people have made adjustments, and that's what I'm trying to do with with the SIP survey as well. You can adjust and you can rescale and understand, even if you account for the level of underreporting that you're likely to see in surveys, you still do not get at 100% participation in all of the programs that we actually think people are entitled to. Now, this is also coming, from HHS recently did a study. So I wrote my article, I think in December 2022. This year, HHS did a study trying to match household surveys with administrative data to look at the question of multiple benefit usage, and they come up with very similar numbers. For people who are at 130% of the federal poverty line or 200% of the federal poverty line or below, they still say about 30% of them say that they do not claim any benefits. Now, we can keep arguing about it's all data, but I think we also know from actual surveys of people and talking to people that accessing programs is a problem. There's tons of paperwork. Sometimes some programs will say you need to meet a caseworker. Sometimes some programs will say, you have to recertify. We're already seeing that with Medicaid, right? A lot of people are becoming ineligible because they forgot to get recertified. So I just don't think that we can completely deny that there is a problem with the system and the way it's working currently. And it's coming even from government sources. It's not,
No kidding.
It's not just, yes, absolutely.
Well, that's a surprise.
Yeah. And so I just feel like we should not completely be dismissive that there is a problem. The Urban Institute did a recent study saying if actually there was 100% participation in the social safety net, the way it's actually, if everybody who was eligible were actually allowed to participate, we would be spending about $200 billion more than we're doing currently. Only about 60% of benefit programs are actually used by people, about 60% of benefit receipt is actually being taken up under the current system. So clearly there's a problem with, accessing programs, trying to understand the struggles that people go through. There are case study after case study. Code for America, which is an agency that's now working with state governments to do what you're trying to do, right? How do we make sure people can access multiple programs by putting in the information one time? Why do we make people go to multiple different agencies and offices and say, oh, now I'm applying for TANF, and now I'm applying for SNAP, and now I'm applying for WIC? Right? Why? If we really believe that people should get the help they need, we should make an online form, just like you and I can go to our phones and access anything we want now easily, right? Any tech company could actually design a system that helps people get the help they need and actually tackle fraud and actually figure out, are people abusing the system? But for some reason, we don't have that system currently. So I think it's easy to argue about the data to make sure, to sort of infer that, yes, the problem is not with actual benefit receipt, it's actually with the data and the way we measure it. But I do think we need to go a little bit deeper than that.
Michael, you want to? No, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to actually change the way we look at this a little bit. Get away from sort of the data debate here and look at what we're talking about when we're talking about poverty altogether. I think one of the clearest examples of this was if you saw when the Census Bureau came out with its recent list, recent numbers for how many people were in poverty. The headlines were all talking about how the poverty rate, particularly among children, doubled. And it was largely because pandemic era programs, the child tax credit expansion and the pandemic era programs disappeared. They expired as they were meant to do. So what you had was a case where people were poor. We gave them this benefit. We said, they're not poor anymore. As soon as the program or the benefit disappears, we say they're poor again. My suggestion is that they were poor all along, and we just disguised the fact that they were poor by sort of papering it over with these benefits. Poverty isn't just a matter of income versus expenditures. I mean, yes, that's important. We certainly will have to, it's sort of a necessary, but it's not sufficient. Poverty is a lack of the ability to run your own life. It's a lack of ability to move up. It's a lack of ability for your children to move up. Poverty is much more about an opportunity question than it is simply an income question. And I think that as long as we're focused strictly on making poverty less miserable by papering over it with benefits, then we're not really achieving all that we can be doing. And I think what we really need to be doing is focusing on creating opportunities for people to get out of poverty altogether, not just on how much the benefit level should be along the way.
First of all, the data that she's using for earnings comes from surveys. It doesn't come from it comes from surveys. It doesn't come from administrative data. So in the SIP survey or any one of these surveys, the earnings that are in there showing that the people are poor is wrong. It's off by 30 or 40%. We know that. So the simplest way to think about this, if you look at so-called low-income families with children, these are families with, say, below 200% of official poverty, which is $50,000 a year. Okay, the amount of money that we spend on low-income families with children is around $500 billion a year. And there are about 10 million of these families. So there's $50,000 per family there, which never shows up in any of the surveys that we're talking about there. So where did it go? Did we dump it in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean? No, in fact, it was received by these families. We know it was received, and that's hidden from the taxpayer forever. Can I solve all these problems? No, but you can do a lot. When we did welfare reform in the 1990s, illegitimacy, the percentage of children born out of wedlock, was increasing 1 to 2% a year, like a straight line going upward. It looked like a rocket taking off. Everyone regarded that as an insoluble problem. Teen pregnancy had quadrupled in a few decades, straight upward, right? All of those at that time were regarded as largely insoluble problems. When we came in and said, you will no longer get a lifetime of free benefits. And Clinton, to his credit, was the one that put that message out. And we backed it up. All of a sudden, immediately, that illegitimacy rate flattens out. It stops going up. The percentage of children in married couple families flattens out. Teen pregnancy drops like a stone. Amazing changes for relatively modest changes, however, that were conservative in nature and supported by people who didn't believe that you should penalize people for getting married or should do it less, and they didn't believe in giving free handouts to people who could work to support themselves.
I think that probably a lot of people in this room believe and subscribe to the view that marriage is important in being raised in a two-parent family, and also yourself getting married after or before having children and things like that. We got people in the room who talk a lot about this. What are each of yours best ideas for how to reform welfare so that it incentivizes children within a two-parent family or in a married family?
I think the answer lies outside the welfare system. I mean, to some degree, you do have to work with the fact that we have marriage penalties built into the welfare system. The Earned Income Tax Credit, for example, is much more subsidy for having children. It tends to encourage you to have children rather than to get married. It discourages work and so on. The way it's designed today, I think a lot of the programs work that way. But I think we also have to ask ourselves exactly who are these women supposed to marry? It's not like there's this giant pool of inner city computer programmers that are waiting around to scoop them up. I think what we need to do is a lot of work that Richard Reeves and others have done in terms of how to make men more marriageable. Now, you have work that William Julius Wilson and others have done that says we've taken 1.5 million men out of the marriage pool because of criminal justice system. They're on probation, they have criminal records that make it difficult to get jobs and so on. We have lack of jobs in some areas that make it difficult for men to support a family. We have educational problems, all of these other problems that lie outside the welfare system that we need to address in order to make men more marriageable. Most people want to get married. Something like 87% of women actually get married over the course of their lifetime. Marriage is something that's desirable, but they want to marry the right person. We don't want to force people into bad marriages. We don't want to force people into abusive marriages. We don't want to force people into marriages where the man can't participate in supporting the family. we want sort of stable situations to create it, and that requires a change to how we look at the whole question of marriageability.
So it's interesting you say that, Avik. So I started reading Melissa Carney's book. Obviously, it's like the biggest, hottest thing around these days. And, I was trying to look at the policy solutions there, because the interesting thing that she points out is that not only is marriage more likely amongst like the higher educated, they're already doing much better, right? So they already have the high levels of education. Then they're marrying someone who has a similar high level of education, and they're the ones who are most likely to have kids together and stay married. So it seems to be skewing towards that system where, a lot of the income and wealth is now going towards family who were already better off, and that's why it's a privilege. And even she sort of shies away from saying, let's promote, like we can promote marriage, but what does that mean, right? You cannot interfere in people's choices. And as Michael pointed out, sometimes people have very, there are economic reasons to not get married, right? Like if men are not doing as well, or there are high rates of incarceration or other social challenges, right? You're not going to be able to push people into the setup that we know seems to work better. But at the same time, how do we think about increasing resources for families who are, for single mothers maybe, right, who are in those situations? And she says, well, what are we actually missing, right, in a single parent home as opposed to a two-parent home, right? One is income. One is the time factor, right? If there are two parents, you're able to juggle much more. If you're a single parent, you're juggling, too many things, and you're not able to handle a lot. So the safety net, I think, can come in. We have, the earned income tax credit that does a lot more for families with children. The child tax credit, during 2021 was greatly expanded. I personally think the reason it worked really well was, it was like a cash transfer to families with children. It was like a basic, basically a universal basic income for families with children. But we can think about changing the safety net. So yes, families who are single parents are actually helped a lot more through the system. And then reducing marriage penalties in the tax code is obviously another way to go at it. So I don't think that there's a single, we're not going to address all of the challenges through the safety net, but we can improve resources, and we can figure out other childcare subsidies that make it easier for single mothers to get the childcare that they need when they're in the workplace, right, rather than relying on the second parent. So I think that, issues within the safety net that could work.
Well, we could start with what's already worked, okay? Because this was the exact data I was giving you, that the percentage of children that were born outside of marriage, starting with the war on poverty, was at 7% and had risen to the high 30s by the time welfare reform rolls around. And all of a sudden that comes to a stop. Gee, I wonder what happened. Well, what happened was you changed the welfare system so that you reduced the utility of being a single mother on welfare because she now had to work for her core benefits, and you increased the relative utility of marriage. And all of a sudden, every single metric that relates to this, marriage rates, non-marital pregnancy rates, non-marital abortion rates, non-marital birth rates, they all immediately and dramatically shift in the direction we wanted them to go. And as a result of that, there have been 10 million fewer abortions to non-married women after welfare reform. The rates stopped going up and they flattened out, or they went down. And we did that by two things. We reduced the utility of welfare, which is predominantly goes to non-married single mothers, by putting a work requirement on it. And we made it much more reasonable and attractive to pay attention to who the father of the children was. Now, one consequence of that today, the other thing that we need to have is actual information, okay? That's always an advantage, all right? So if you look today, 25% of children that are born to non-married cohabiting couples. The guy is in the house, and he's been in the house for quite a while. He actually is not a jailbird, and he tends to earn more than the mother does, okay? Now, of that 25%, a quarter of them subsequently marry, but they're not married at the time, and another quarter will stay together for up to 10 years after that birth, but they never marry. And one of the reasons they were not married in the first place and don't get married is because the welfare system smashes them as hard as it possibly can right in the face. You do not get married or we will take these benefits away. We will take these benefits away. And they all understand that, okay? And so if you take, for example, a low-income couple where the father earns $20,000 a year, the mother earns $20,000 a year, he puts a ring on her fingers, they lose $8,000 to $9,000 a year in welfare benefits, just like that. Bang, okay? And so the first thing we should do is do no harm. Don't penalize couples when they get married. Now, that must cost a fortune. No. You can do that within existing resources by, for example, removing the 40% fraud rate in EITC. Okay? You could also get rid of the programs that give extravagant benefits to single-parent families, such as Section 8 housing, which on top of all the other benefits gives about $15,000 to $20,000 a year core benefit in housing, has a huge marriage penalty on it, has a huge penalty on work on it, and when the family is getting that in addition to everything else, their incomes are typically up in the mid-60s, okay? Never counted. You'll never, ever see that data, except I have a report here you can look at if you're interested. And that data would be backed up by administrative records. So what do? You continue to strengthen what welfare reform did. You strengthen the work requirements on all these programs that predominantly subsidize single parents, food stamps, housing, remove fraud and strengthen work requirements in EITC, which are quite malleable, and then you use the savings to remove those marriage penalties to the extent you can, and that 1/4 of families that where the child is currently born without marriage, I think that number will continue to go down. I would emphasize that if people, when we said in 1994 that welfare reform could stop the disintegration of the family, people laughed at us. They knew that was absolutely impossible. But that is exactly what happened by putting the core conservative principles into the welfare state.
I had a question on the Social Security Disability Insurance Program. 10 years ago, Tom Coburn, who I was working for at the time, put out an investigative report looking at SSDI case files. We spent a summer, really it was longer than that, but I was working on it over the summer, looking at 300 case files of Social Security disability applications. We found about 1/4 of them were probably wrongly decided or decided with lacking evidence. When we look at the explosion in disability costs, my impression, last time I looked, it dwarfed TANF by multiples. It's much more spending. And there's likely a big overlap between the opioid crisis, as SSDI is links into Medicaid eligibility, and a lot of from the files we were looking at the time, a lot of them were describing back pain. I think there's a big issue there. Be curious if any of you all have looked at that or have any thoughts about reforming this aspect of the safety net.
Yeah, two problems that exist with the Social Security Disability program specifically. One is the fact that in the change of what constitutes a disability. If you look over time, if you go back about 20 years ago, it was primarily people who had heart attacks and people who had cancer and things of that nature that made it impossible to work. Today, it's actually, I believe, stress and back pain are the two biggest cases of what's qualifying for disability. The second is disability insurance tends to act as a light switch. You're either disabled or you're not. So you're basically, if you can work at all, I mean, you talk about work disincentives. Within the disability insurance program, it's a huge work disincentive. Because if you can work at all, you don't get disability benefits. If you want to qualify, you have to not work pretty much at all. So it's a disability. You're more easier to get on disability now because of what's being diagnosed as a disabled condition, and you're being discouraged from work once you're on it.
I think that's exactly right. I remember researching that a few years ago, and on average, it seemed to be taking people about 2 years to actually get onto the SSDI rolls. And so that made it, when they were faced with, should I take up that extra job or, work longer? And if your income, I think, went up about something like a really minimum $800, $900 a month, you would suddenly be off the rolls. And so it seemed to be that, a lot of people were making that decision and knew that it would be really hard, having gotten onto the rolls, to, if you got pushed off the rolls suddenly, then it would take another 2 years for you to get back on. So it did create that work disincentive to do that. And I remember thinking at that time, like, if we had something like the EITC phase out, right? Like, because SSDI, you're either in or out. But I think if we had a bit of a phase out where we said it's okay for you to continue to earn, slightly more income, and your benefit receipt goes down marginally over time, I think that would be a way for people to ramp back into the workforce. And right now that system, doesn't seem to be existing.
I'll take a different tact on this. I'll be repetitive. If you look at the fentanyl crisis, okay, let's look at two metrics. People that are out of the labor force that should be working, and people that are part of the opioid crisis. There's one group there. It's unmarried men with a low to moderate education, okay? Some college or high school graduate or not, they're not married, okay? That is the group overwhelmingly that where you see the huge drop that's occurred in labor force participation. It's in that group. It's not in working single moms, okay? And also, that's the group that dies from opioid poisoning, okay? It's the same group, okay? Why? Because you stole the purpose of their lives. They are no longer breadwinners. The welfare system pushed them out. The welfare system said, you don't need this guy. A woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle, okay? And the welfare system is structured on that idea. And you pushed all of these, non-star but still stable reasons. These are not people that have, huge conviction rates and things like that. They're just ordinary people who never became married breadwinners. And a man who is an adult, has never been a married breadwinner, he doesn't have much reason to be working really hard, okay? I know a lot of these guys because I'm older, guys who ordinarily you would have expected that they got married, they never did, and they kind of just drift through life, and they drift into things that destroy them as well. So both in terms of labor force participation, which is not the key, but in terms of quality of life, the most important thing that you could do is to bring those people back into the home in the next generation. This is the same group that I just said, a quarter of all children are born to men and women who are not married at the time that the child is born, but who overwhelmingly tend to stay together for a bit and then fall apart. The welfare system should encourage them to stay together. It should not penalize them for getting married. By doing that over time, you're going to restore the cultural role to these fathers, and everyone will benefit. The children will benefit, the mothers will benefit, the fathers will clearly benefit, and society will benefit.
Yeah, so with the marriage question, right, you said some portion of these people, they're like all but married, right? They're like living together and they have these, so when you break it down, I still agree with the general policy idea of don't punish people to do that. But when we're looking at the data and seeing these disproportionate outcomes, how much of the disproportionate outcomes comes from the 50% where there's really no one in the household? Like, it's not that you file some paperwork at City Hall and then everything's okay. So I mean, I know this is difficult I presume from some of the data questions that you put out there, but
No, there's been a change to the extent that non-marital births increased at all. They used to be, if you went back before welfare reform, these used to be single mothers totally alone, okay? To the extent that now it's disproportionately single mothers, that group has not increased at all. It's single mothers who are with the father, but they're not married, and they tend to stay together, but not as much as you would want. Okay, and one of the things we know about relationships is commitment is very, very important to relationships. All relationships go through what are called arid patches. Okay, if you have a formal social commitment to one another and you have an ethos and culture of commitment, then you are much more likely to ride that through. And we've eroded that culture as well for low-income people. None of this stuff hurt the upper middle class. You could have all the, escape from patriarchy, sociology 503 at Vassar you needed, okay? They did not have kids without being married, okay? The people that did, that caught the virus from that were the women and the men who could least afford that kind of choice. And they are not anti-marriage, okay? If you ask them, they tend to say, yeah, I think marriage is a great idea, but they tend to regard marriage as you might regard a trip to Honolulu or something. It's something you'd love to do in the future. They no longer perceive that it's a prerequisite or important precondition for having kids. You need to get that reversed. But you can't reverse that if at the same time you say, it would be better if you selected the right guy, you got pregnant with the right guy, you guys made a commitment to each other. But by the way, if you do that, we're going to take away $10,000 a year. Yeah. It's hypocrisy to the highest, and the Republican Party is very guilty of this. The penalties against marriage are not in the tax code. They're in the 90 different means-tested welfare programs, all of which have substantial marriage penalties. They need to be removed now.
Hello, thank you for the panel. My question is, I'm curious how distracting the term safety net is. I know it probably came about through complicated historical reasons and circumstances, but I'm wondering how much the term is a distraction these days. Does a person deserve to be on the safety net? Did they do enough to not need the safety net? Should these people actually be unsafe in certain ways? But this question, poor people are generally incentivized by money. That's one of the great things about being us poor folks is money can incentivize them to do things. So this question of incentive to work, incentive to do different things, it seems like there's agreement that some of the incentives are incorrect. I'm wondering, since we have the three of you together, if some of you have ideas for a different frame to view the problem in that's not the safety net frame.
Well, I think earlier when I was talking about poverty, I think that the idea is not a minimal amount of survivability. We're not trying to make poverty less miserable. What we should be trying to do is enable people to escape poverty. And by poverty, I mean sort of that state of existence in which you have no control over your life. You're basically dependent on others, whether you're basically being treated like a child, just getting an allowance from your parents. I want people to be able to have control over their lives where they can make the decisions in their lives for themselves. And that's more than just an income-based thing. I mean, I think a minimum amount of income is necessary, but insufficient. It certainly shouldn't be our goal of what public policy should be. We should aspire to much more than that.
I think if the idea is, what can we do to address poverty and how do we improve economic opportunity? There are tons of, there's a lot of research out there that says, helping people move to better neighborhoods where they have better access to schools and education and the right networks and, giving them that boost in their early childhood years, really helps in improving test scores and things. So there's a lot of research on addressing poverty, but through channels that seem to work for everyone else, right? Like the reason we are where we are today is because we went to the good schools and we stayed in school and we had access to good job options and networking. I think when it comes to the safety net, one idea I've had is you're exactly right? Like right now we're trying to do too much through the safety net. And so we keep worrying about every different program that comes in. We're like, oh my God, are people going to misuse this? And how do I make sure that I don't give them too much, but I give them just enough, right? And so one of the ideas I've had is if you really just want to help people, at their time of need, maybe you do offer something that's a temporary, immediate temporary cash support, right? You lose your job. It's kind of like how unemployment insurance works, except unemployment insurance right now reaches not everybody who's eligible. It's about 40% on average of people who are actually eligible for UI actually receive it. But what if you actually did give people the cash support, on a temporary targeted basis and said, look, here's your 2 months of absorbing the economic shock that you've received. And then, during that time, like Michael said, that maybe that immediate support is enough to get them out of that period of, job loss or something else that happened. And then if they still need the additional support, then they move on to the traditional, safety net that comes with a ton of strings attached, right? Like, yes, you do need the work incentives. I'm not here arguing that, we should give everyone extended cash support on an indefinite basis, right? But you do need something to work like a safety net, and then a separate piece that actually pushes you back into, you can go and get training, you can get an education, you can be in the labor force. The government can still continue to support you, but the primary focus should be on getting you back into the labor market. Right, but there should be an initial period where that's not expected, right? You are getting the help you need, and you are helped with dealing with the economic conditions that you're facing then, before you move on to trying to access different programs and showing eligibility and making sort of dealing with the work incentives section.
That proposal destroys welfare reform. What you need to do. There are 90 different means-tested welfare programs. These are programs that are not universal but are restricted to low-income people, okay? So the other part of the safety net are things like Social Security and Medicare or unemployment insurance that are available broadly without a broad income test. For the 90 programs, means-tested programs, on which we spend about 6% of GDP, there are, again, 3 pretty simple principles. Encourage marriage, don't penalize it, require work in exchange for the benefits you get. The left is always opposed that. They opposed it when Clinton was president. They oppose it now. Their goal is to get rid of that idea. And then finally, make sure that the programs that are designed to empower people and give them greater capacity to succeed in life actually do something, okay? Instead of just spending money. That if you want to make sure that you're never hired on K Street, that idea will do it, because that wipes out the entire social service industry right there, because none of their programs work, okay? But you should go and do that, and then you actually will find some programs that do work, and you put the money into them. I'm not calling for a huge scale back of the welfare state. I am calling to not to have another 300 billion expansion on top of the 1.5 trillion we currently spend. And I'm calling in particular not to spend this money in the way most of it's currently spent, which is anti-work, anti-marriage, and for programs that are basically charades and farces.